This is Whitley Strieber. I'm talking to Dave Paulides, his book, Missing 411, his website, nabigfootsearch.com. That's nabigfootsearch.com. I'm going to talk, before we get into what happened in New York, in Ellenville, New York, I'd like to just touch on your Bigfoot research, Dave. You're still very actively involved in that.
Well, we just released a 5-year study of Bigfoot DNA, and that was released within the last month. So that was probably the first time that's ever been accomplished, and that was huge. Yeah,
we had Dr. Koecher on the show, actually, talking about it just recently. And so that was really, it was something, and you believe that research is credible. It's been criticized 6 ways from Sunday on the internet because it's the last thing people who have denied the existence of Bigfoot for so long want to believe. But the research seems to me to be done at a very high level of credibility, and it's still not finished, is it?
Well, I think that the people that criticize haven't read the study, and the ones that have read it probably don't understand the science behind it. But if you really take the time to read it, and you understand that 3 different extremely credible labs did the testing, and the results are unusual, but they are the results. And if you look at the old guard in the Bigfoot world, they've said, for the last 45, 50 years that we're dealing with an ape, and all their books are based on it being an ape, and now the study comes out and it's much more human-based than it is ape-based. It kind of throws some big smoke up in the air and makes these people irate that we got these results.
Yeah, I knew a Native American man years ago. He's passed on now, who used to refer to the authority figures in the world as the big smoke. And he always say, well, the big smoke says this and the big smoke says that. And I always would think, well, smoke is something that disappears very quickly. And maybe that's going to happen here because it's like the UFO researchers. When I began to talk about unusual aspects of the close encounter phenomenon that they didn't want to hear about, they just tuned me out. I am literally persona non grata at any national MUFON meetings because I say things they don't want to hear. The National UFO Conference that's just recently held, they've had me once, I think twice in 30 years at that conference. And now, admittedly, I didn't go for a long time because it was in a casino and I'm so allergic to cigarette smoke that I couldn't handle it. But now that it's not there, I was invited once, and I doubt I'll ever be invited again because I stood up and said there are connections with the dead. I talk about little people and fairy folk and folklore, and I'm perfectly willing to say this may not have anything to do with aliens at all. So they don't like that. I understand where you're coming from. Dave, now let me set the scene, folks. And I've told you this story before, so I'm going to just tell it in very briefly. And then Dave is going to talk about a disappearance that happened quite nearby. One morning in late January, early February of 1987, I was called by the visitors with a sound like the sound of a shofar or a ram's horn, early in the morning, just at the crack of dawn. And I went out because I had in my mind the idea that a meeting was being planned. I had even had a little bench built where we could sit. I went out and I went into the woods toward the place where I had met the visitors or had been taken by the visitors in December of 1985. And I paused because I could see something down in that clearing, a big object, and I could see figures standing near it. And I was rather frightened. I mean, to be honest with you, you can't tell with a thing like this, is it really all in my head or not? And suddenly what I'd been imagining was coming true before my eyes. So, I was really weary. And then I heard, as I stood there just in a little woods beside this clearing, a short distance from my house, I heard a very rough voice say, "Come on, come on." And I wasn't sure I've never been sure whether it was just a voice I kind of heard like a radio in my head or if it was actually in the air around me. But in any case, it was frightening. I turned around and went back to the house because I thought this could be terribly dangerous, and I've got a family. If I disappear, what happens to Anne and what happens to our little boy? He was about 8 at the time, I guess. And they'd just be left without any support. And as you know all too well, it takes a long time for people to be declared dead when they're missing persons, if there's no trace found. And so I went back to the house and proceeded. As I touched the doorknob, I heard 3 cries that were the most extraordinary, deepest emotional sounds I've ever heard in my life. I'll never forget them. And I then went back into my bedroom and had a very powerful experience of being returned to the first moment that I could walk. In other words, for me, this was a very rich, amazing communication and an experience with someone who struck me as being extremely wise and very knowledgeable. And I have related it to certain things in mythology that I won't get into here, but it was a really classic experience of something called refusal of the call in spiritual terms, and a very important experience in my life. Now, 7 miles away, and conceivably even on that same night or close to it, something very different was happening. Could you tell about this case?
Yeah, it's in fact, I will tell your listeners that this is the first time I've heard of this from you, so it's a shock to me as well. But there's an area near Ellensville, New York, where the local kids used to drive up to this area near Sam's Point Ice Caves, and there was a place called Mount Cathalia Lodge, Cathalia.
There's a boulder field there too, by the way. But go ahead.
And they used to go up there and drive and hang out and party, and it was an abandoned lodge, kind of a spooky place, but they had fun getting their friends there. On the way down one day in mid-January of 1987 at about 4 a.m., this guy named Joseph Helt, 17 years old, was with 3 other buddies. The car got stuck, and they tried getting it out. There's about 2 feet of snow on the ground, and they couldn't get it unstuck. And Joseph said, "Hey, I'm just going to walk home. It's not that far. It's a few miles." And he'd been on this road probably hundreds of times. He knew his way like the back of the hand. And he took off, and the other guys were still trying to get the car out. The next morning, Joseph didn't appear at work, and they went to look for him. Make a long story short, big search started. 15 miles northeast of this is a place called Witch's Hole State Park, just to give you some idea of the strangeness of the area.
Oh, I know it well. Believe me, I've been to both places many times. Go ahead.
And again, like you said, Whitley, there was a large boulder field right near this location. They searched the boulder field, they searched the lodge, they searched the mountains. There was a new police officer that was on the force at this time who is now the police chief of Ellensville, who adamantly said that the guys that he was with are not suspects in the case. This is a missing persons case, and it's one of the most baffling missing persons cases that they've ever had.
And you know, Lake Maritanza back in there, I've hiked up to Lake Maritanza many times, which was right near there. And I had an experience, a lot of strange experiences up in there. But one of the strangest was when I was hiking near Lake Maritanza, all of a sudden a red-winged blackbird, which are common in the area, began flying in my face. And I couldn't figure out why, but I became very wary because something wasn't right. And then I realized if I took another step, I was going to be in quicksand.
Wow.
Yeah, and there was... And you know, you just have to wonder, it wouldn't have been deep enough, I don't think, to swallow me up. But it's a strange area. But go ahead. There was no quicksand around where he was disappeared, I hasten to add. But just the idea that a bird would start warning you like that, it saved my life. When I turned away from the quicksand, the bird left. It's just a weird area, is my point.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and the point of this story is that it was on the outskirts of town. It wasn't an unusual area. There haven't been, other than what you're saying right now, I mean, we couldn't find any other people that fit the criteria in that town, but not finding this man or this boy at the time is extremely unusual. And there was a storm afterwards. They brought canines in. Nobody could pick up a scent. They couldn't find anything of him.
There's often a storm involved.
Often.
And they never found a trace of him. Not a trace.
Nothing.
Well, you know, it makes me wonder. I had the most extraordinary feeling. My son, a few years ago, said to me that he was going to go back up there and just hang out. And I said, don't stay out there at night. The words just came out of me. And I wonder what we are dealing with when I could have had such an extraordinary and beautiful experience on the one hand, scary too, and on the other hand, this may be connected, happened a few miles away, and possibly literally on the same night or close to it. It just is very, very disturbing, frankly. Now, Dave, it's so you can't really take the next step with this and say, well, this is probably what's happening. But, I have to tell you, there's something out there. And it's not just in my neck of the woods up there in the old cabin area. It's all over the country, maybe all over the world. And how well do other countries? I know that you write you have some interesting material in Missing 411 about other countries, and there are specific cases from some of them. But most countries don't really keep very specific records about this, do they?
Well, no, and it's difficult. It's difficult when there aren't the availability of articles and news sources, and they aren't free to give up their law enforcement reports to ensure that the criteria that we're trying to stick with stays consistent when we go into these other countries. So it gets difficult quickly.
In fact, there could be massive numbers of people disappearing from the face of the earth every day. In fact, all over the world, for all we know.
For all we know, based just on what we're doing in North America, it would seem that could be logical.
Do you have a number, say an annual number, in North America of people who disappear without a trace?
I probably don't right now because it would be a complete guess, just because I know how much we miss and our availability of picking up this information is really, really difficult. This book that I just came out with, many of the stories came from other readers of my other books and have helped us out and pointed us in the right direction, because otherwise we never would have found them.
Yeah, well, like the Alan Lammers case you mentioned in the book, and you say that it came from me and Ann, and which it did.
Exactly.
And you never would have known about it. I wouldn't have known about it if Alan had not contacted me on Facebook or somewhere. I just never would have known. But these things happen. They happen all over the world. Actually, this kind of disappearance is just part of being human. And I wonder where they all go. And I have to ask you, in terms of the people who have come back, have there been any really very specific stories about what happened to them? Or has it mostly just been the kind of confusion that we discussed on Dreamland?
There was a story out of Northern California, from the Mount Shasta area. A small boy disappeared along a river that I used to fish as a boy. That's how unusual this is. And famous trout fishing area. And he disappeared from his folks. And they searched for him, and they didn't find him until very, very late that night, and they found him hiding in a bush, which is pretty common. And he told a story not to his parents, but he told a story to his grandma, that he was taken down into a cave. And he said that the woman that was talking to him looked like his grandma. And he thought that he thought that she was a robot, and he thought that there were other robots in the room that weren't working. And that the woman laid down a piece of paper and told him to poop on the paper. And he couldn't. And he said that she got mad, and it wasn't long after that he was taken out of this cave and placed in this bush area to be taken. And that is probably the most detail I've ever heard about where people go.
My word, there was a case in Tennessee, one of the eeriest cases in my files, where a woman and her son were out walking in the woods, and they were suddenly confronted by a little, as they put it, a little man in a blue uniform, dark blue uniform, which my listeners will be very familiar with, that image. And he said to them, he came out of a cave that they were walking past, and he said to them that he was a rebel, and that he wanted to tell them that in the distant past there had been a war between Mars and Earth, and we had destroyed the surface of Mars and made it unlivable. But they had captured our souls, and they kept us on a perpetual cycle of dying and living and being born and dying and living and being born and never leaving that cycle. And their name for Earth was Dead Forever. It's an incredibly eerie story. And yet, there are so many stories that have to do with caves. One of the places I used to go to most reliably have contact with the visitors was a cave that's probably not but 5 miles from where the young man from Ellenville disappeared. A cave. Do you feel haunted by this show? It's creeping me out. I have to tell you, it's really very creepy. But, we're not here for me to sit here getting creeped out. Instead, I'd like to go on to some other cases. One of the most remarkable cases is the Ronald Tamman case. And if you could, we could, I think we'll probably come to close to a conclusion, because after this I want to discuss clusters in more detail. But let's first go into the Ronald Tamman case.
Well, this is another one of those cases where it touches close to home for me. I have a son that attends Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Plays for their D1 hockey team. And while I was there one day, actually accumulating the things for this new book, I was told about a student there that disappeared in 1953. And there were some really, really strange aspects to the story that supposedly went with it, that supposedly the university was haunted, et cetera, et cetera. So I went to the university administrator's office, and I asked for a special file that they had, that I was told, on this case. And they pulled it out, and it was filled with some great information. And Ron was, in 1953, he was a sophomore at the university. He was on the varsity wrestling team, and he played in a band called the Campus Owls. He had a 3.2 GPA, and he was a resident advisor at a place called Fisher Hall. And Fisher Hall sits up against one of the creeks, 4 Mile Creek, that runs along the university, and an extremely thick wooded area. And what's funny about this, in a weird kind of way, is that Fisher Hall has become a place called Markham Conference Center, which is a place that my son and his team is staying at as we speak. This is weird, because they're on spring break there, but the hockey team has to stay because they're in the playoffs, so they're staying at this location right now. And Dennis, my son, has stayed there last year as well, and we had conversations about it. But Tammin was there. He was in a second-floor room, and he had a fire extinguisher or fire escape right next to his window. And he came home one night at about 8:30 after his band had a gig at a local pub. And as he walked into his room, his roommate wasn't there, he found a fish laying on his bed.
Okay, now I want to stop you right there, and this is why I brought up this case, in part. What you don't know, but now you will know, is in our cases, strange things involving fish are not all that uncommon. Like example, a case where a family has a home, a beautiful estate with a lake, and they can see people, little people actually, they thought they were children, down at their lake. And so they start going down there, and every time they go down there, the people disappear. And finally, their grandfather arms himself with a shotgun and goes down there. And they're warning him, don't take a gun, don't take a gun. This time he's down there for a while, and suddenly they hear the report of a gun. They go running down there, and he's dead. He's not injured in any way whatsoever, but there is something under his skin, an object, a square object is under his skin on his chest. He's taken to the coroner. He's declared dead. There is an autopsy. The object is removed, and as it was sent to higher authorities. They never even got to see it. And the cause of death was listed as unknown. They decided that they didn't want the lake anymore, and they had it drained. When they drained it, they found it to be inexplicably filled with fish, salmon in particular. And it's just one of the many stories that we have involving the appearance of fish in the context of these strange events. Go ahead, please.
So he went to the supervisor of the hall, and he got some new linens. He changed his bed and talked about the fish, and nobody knew anything about it. And it was about 8:45 that night that he ran into two more guys that lived in the hall, and they talked to him, and they state that Ron told him he was disturbed about something, but they didn't know what. That was the last time anybody saw him. And his roommate came back to the room at about 12:30 that night and saw Ron's desk light on, a book was open, a psychology book like he was studying. His wallet, bank book, keys, watch, everything was in his room, and his car was parked in its assigned spot outside. But he wasn't around. His roommate didn't think much about it at the time because they thought maybe he was staying at his fraternity house.
Certainly no evidence of foul play there.
No. And the only thing that they found missing from his room was his pillowcase. And the next day, there was a search, obviously. They notified his parents. That night that he went missing, a storm hit the area. It was rainy and windy. And kind of follow-up on all of it was that they found the coroner for the county in Butler County. He had been contacted by Ron about 4 months earlier, and Ron asked him to do his blood type. And he sent Ron to the local hospital, and he had it typed. And the way
he contacted the coroner?
Yeah, very strange.
Yeah.
And the coroner even said that in his 30 years of being a physician, that he had never had anybody ask him to do it. And that Ron could have gone to the University Med Center and had it done, but he chose not to do that. And they thought that was strange, but they could never really put it together why or what sense this might have made. Some people thought that Ron maybe had his blood type because his girlfriend was pregnant, And actually, they found a girl, and she wasn't pregnant, and that was his. And nobody ever came forward saying that they were carrying his child. And then the other strange thing to this is about 4 months later, in April of 1953, the head of Miami University Housing happened to be in a city called Wellsville, New York, in southern New York State. And he was vacationing with his wife in a little tiny lodge area. And as he's sitting down for dinner, he looks across the room, and he swears that he sees Ron sitting at a table with 3 other young men. And it was as though he described it that Ron was looking at him, but like looking through him. And he said it bothered him, but not so much until he got outside and he told his wife, he says, darn, he goes, I know Ron Tamman, and I think that was him. So he walks back in 5 minutes later, and nobody in the group is there.
Wow.
Now that's not the end of the story, because it even gets stranger. And in everything I've read about this, I couldn't find anything about it until I got into this dossier that the university held, and there was a small book that was written about this incident by a former student. It turns out that 3 weeks after Ron disappeared, people in his hall heard somebody singing out into this rose garden area right outside the hall, right adjacent to the forest and the creek. And it kind of got everybody mad because they were singing pretty loud. And for 3 nights in a row, they'd go out to this garden and they could never see or find anybody. So one night, these guys decide, okay, we're going to get this person. So they surround the yard hours beforehand. It was like a guerrilla tactic to get this guy. And then they slowly started searching at midnight when this song starts getting sung.
Now, this is understood. Understand this, folks. They are surrounding the place where the song is being sung. It's correct. They're right at, they've got him surrounded right now.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's right next to the dorm, and it's right next to the creek and the forest. And what they describe is, as they kind of hone in on the area, this white thing that they describe as much bigger than a human and faster than anybody they've ever seen takes off and starts running through the garden and heads towards a golf course, the creek, and the forest, and is never seen again. And they attributed it initially. They call it, the ghost of Miami University, and then they called it the ghost of Ron Tamman. The reality of it is that it was much bigger, much faster than anything or any student at the university. And that was the last time anyone had ever seen that.
I think that we are literally embedded in another world, in somebody else's world. And we're living in the barnyard, and every once in a while the farmers do something with us, and we don't know quite what it is. But then again, I guess the pigs are pretty confused about what happens to them, too. I have this implant, this object in my left ear. It was planted there, put there, by people, by human beings. I saw them with my own eyes. I couldn't stop them, but I did see them. I heard people speaking to them from the backyard while this was happening. There's no question about the fact that it was done by people. And you have to wonder, folks, and this is where we're going to leave this extraordinary experience of talking to Dave. It is always a wonderful experience to talk. I urge you to listen to all the Dave Paulides stuff that we've got on the site. It's just premier material, full of most extraordinary information. Anyway, I think there are people who are taken, who end up on the other side of the veil that separates us from this other larger world of which we are a part. Dave, I would like very much to thank you for being with us. Folks, his latest, Missing 411, North America and Beyond. And if you've read the others, you ain't read nothing yet. Believe you me. Dave's website, nabigfootsearch.com. Dave, I guess I just have a final question. Do you ever worry that your interest in this might attract some unwanted notice and that you yourself might end up on the other side of that curtain?
That's a great question, Whitley, and I've had some loved ones that are close to me ask me the same thing, and I'm a very, very cautious person, but I tend to think I'm doing good things here, because if I can just cause one family to use a little more caution so that nothing happens to their child, or if I could bring the people's awareness up to what's happening, I've done something good. So I'm not real concerned about it, but it's a point that's been brought up before.
In my own case, I think I went just about as far as you can go down that road, and they didn't steal me, but I'm not so sure that I wasn't just darn lucky. Dave, again, thank you for being with us. This is Whitley Strieber. I'm talking to Dave Paulides, his book, Missing 411, his website, nabigfootsearch.com. That's nabigfootsearch.com. I'm going to talk, before we get into what happened in New York, in Ellenville, New York, I'd like to just touch on your Bigfoot research, Dave. You're still very actively involved in that.
Well, we just released a 5-year study of Bigfoot DNA, and that was released within the last month. So that was probably the first time that's ever been accomplished, and that was huge. Yeah,
we had Dr. Koecher on the show, actually talking about it just recently, and so that was really, it was something, and you believe that
it kind of throws some big smoke up in the air and makes these people irate that we got these results.
Yeah, I knew a Native American man years ago. He's passed on now, who used to refer to the authority figures in the world as the big smoke. And he always say, well, the big smoke says this, and the big smoke says that. And I always would think, well, smoke is something that disappears very quickly. And maybe that's going to happen here, because it's like the UFO researchers. When I began to talk about unusual aspects of the close encounter phenomenon that they didn't want to hear about, they just tuned me out. I am literally persona non grata at any national MUFON meetings, because I say things they don't want to hear. The National UFO Conference that's just recently held, they've had me once, I think twice in 30 years at that conference. And now, admittedly, I didn't go for a long time because it was in a casino, and I'm so allergic to cigarette smoke that I couldn't handle it. But now that it's not there, I was invited once, and I doubt I'll ever be invited again, because I stood up and said there are connections with the dead. I talk about little people and fairy folk and folklore, and I'm perfectly willing to say this may not have anything to do with aliens at all. So they don't like that. I understand where you're coming from. Dave, now let me set the scene, folks. And I've told you this story before, so I'm going to just tell it in very briefly. And then Dave is going to talk about a disappearance that happened quite nearby. One morning in late January, research is credible. It's been criticized 6 ways from Sunday on the internet, because it's the last thing people who have denied the existence of Bigfoot for so long want to believe. But the research seems to me to be done at a very high level of credibility, and it's still not finished, is it?
Well, I think that the people that criticize haven't read the study, and the ones that have read it probably don't understand the science behind it. But if you really take the time to read it, and you understand that 3 different extremely credible labs did the testing, and the results are unusual, but they are the results. And if you look at the old guard in the Bigfoot world, they've said, for the last 45, 50 years that we're dealing with an ape, and all their books are based on it being an ape. And now the study comes out, and it's much more human-based than it is ape-based.
Very early February of 1987, I was called by the visitors with a sound like the sound of a shofar or a ram's horn, early in the morning, just at the crack of dawn. And I went out because I had in my mind the idea that a meeting was being planned. I had even had a little bench built where we could sit. I went out and I went into the woods toward the place where I had met the visitors or had been taken by the visitors in December of 1985. And I paused because I could see something down in that clearing, a big object, and I could see figures standing near it. And I was rather frightened. I mean, to be honest with you,